Dr. Dale McKinley, an independent writer and political analyst at the International Labour Research and Information Group. Dr. McKinley, good morning.
Good morning, Cathy, and to your listeners.
Pleasure to have you on.
Absolutely.
So, of course, we saw just soon after the establishment of a government, and when it became very clear that we no longer had a Department of Public Enterprises, the president then assigning responsibility for these SOEs to the various departments that they would normally also be sharing some of the reporting responsibilities with. And of course, part of what that means is that this plan for a national agency that would manage these state enterprises is probably on hold until further notice. Duma, before we get into the position taken by the DA and what this is likely to mean then for government going forward, let's just reflect on these state-owned entities. Before we went to verse notes, I was a bit stuck because I couldn't remember. Well, are we in the sixth or seventh administration? We are, of course, in the seventh administration, but the promises around the turnaround of SOE started in the fifth administration when we saw President Ramaphosa take over from former President Jacob Zuma.
Yes, Cathy, thank you so much for the invite. There's just one thing I want to say. The government on Friday talked about this state-owned company, holding company for 13 companies. And, it is the most bizarre, idiotic proposal I've ever come across, because I refused to even engage it because I thought it was so bizarre that it would never come to fruition. But now government, I really question the quality of the leaders that we have. And when I talk to the younger people, I say the really sad thing for you is that there are no role models to look up to. That when I grow up, I want to be like, well, Cathy, you are a role model, but in the political space, there are no role models. We saw in London, speaking to the Financial Times, the Deputy President, Paul Mashatile, says, we've got no money to invest in our economy. What a bizarre statement, because one of the main reasons that our economy has collapsed over the past 15 years is that the government has stopped investing in its people and its infrastructure. Public investment has gone down by 25% over the past 15 years. And what the government should realize, economics 101, when the government spends $1 billion rands on infrastructure, GDP grows by about 2.7, according to the IMF, 2.7 billion rands. Infrastructure spending creates the income to more than pay for itself. Now, on the state holding company, what are they trying to solve for? There's only one thing that every single policy must try to solve for, is this collapsing GDP growth, 1.2% over the past 15 years, and the soaring unemployment, 42.6% unemployment. And as I said, one of the major reasons for that, and there are many reasons, not just one reason, is the collapse in infrastructure spending. So I don't understand how this, I was looking over the weekend, a lot of the ANC people, they went to China, and then they picked up stompies from certain ideas that happened in China. And, when I go to that country, I go there to learn and not to shop, and it's completely different to what they're saying. So this holding company, it's a mix between what they saw in China and what they saw in Singapore with Temasek, and it's a completely different situation that we're finding ourselves in South Africa today. Yeah.
All right, Duma. Okay, we're going to come back to some of those reflections in a moment. Dale?
Yeah, you want me to give my perspective on your same question?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Yes, please, on the same question.
Okay, so listen. I mean, I think Duma's points are well taken in terms of the lack of infrastructure spending, but fundamentally, our problem here is the lack of a political will and a political impetus to basically run government according to the needs of the majority of the people. SOEs and the entire macroeconomics program have been part of a sort of agenda that has tried to see sort of big investments and white elephant investments and other kinds of things taking precedence over basically building local economies, building infrastructure, building things that help ordinary people, small, medium scale enterprises, give opportunities to those. We've seen all the promises of this, but very little. So we have our entire macroeconomic program is a top-down, trickle-down approach, and the SOEs have followed this. And as a result of that, what you do is you have a top-heavy, administration. You have most of your expenses are going to salaries and to high-paying people who are not necessarily should be in those positions or are not necessarily qualified for those positions because cadre deployment has taken over. And then in the context of then trying to roll out particular programs and actually run the kinds of entities and enterprises that fall under the SOEs, those suffer as a result because governance and delivery is not at the priority. It's about keeping your job. It's about making sure you pad the finances for those who are at the top. It's about making sure you have control over tenders and being able to continue a political patronage system. So one can talk about growth and one can talk about these kinds of things that we need, but fundamentally for that to happen, we need a new political situation where our political leadership is dedicated to a public sector that meets public needs. It's simple as that, and we've seen in many other countries where that is the case, where you can put the right people in the right place, where you can have cost reflective policies, where you can basically bring in where you need to some degree of private sector enterprise and expertise, but keeping public ownership and public mandates. We don't have that. We have a situation where our political class has basically used the state for its own purposes. And as a result, we've got a crisis. That crisis is not only a crisis of growth, it's a crisis of accountability, it's a crisis of transparency, and fundamentally, it's a crisis of not wanting to basically keep the state for the people who have voted you into power. And in that context, this question that we're dealing with is as much about democracy as it is about the economy.
Duma, do you get the sense that we are seeing many of the efforts to try and stabilize some of these SOEs coming to fruition? And maybe let's start with the big ones, right? So if we look at Eskom and Transnet and we look at Operation Vulindlela and the role that has played, particularly in trying to streamline whatever intervention efforts there may be from the state for the functioning of those entities, one today could say Transnet is perhaps in a better position than it was maybe 2 years ago. Could the same argument also be made for Eskom because we're not having load shedding? So what I'm asking is, are we seeing the real impact or difference in how these SOEs are functioning? And I'm intentional about using the example of Eskom and Transnet because they're the ones that have received the most attention, and they're the ones, of course, that have a very direct impact on the functioning of this economy.
Thank you so much, Cathy. So I was actually going there. My next thing is that the SOEs are not all the same. Eskom and Transnet have macroeconomic impacts. They account for the bulk of public, investment in the economy. So I just went back to the issue of growth quickly. Growth is an outcome of the government investing in its people and its infrastructure. But I tend to sometimes express it the other way around. Yeah. But anyway, so Operation Vulindlela, let's be honest what it is about. It's about privatization, deregulation, liberalization, and the withdrawal of the state from what are called network industries. That's electricity, transport, water, and communications. Let's start with Eskom. So Eskom and Transnet are the bulk of the state-owned companies by size and by employment. So as you correctly say, that's where we start. Now let's start with Eskom. South Africans must understand that there are two problems at Eskom. Number one is an operational problem. Number two is a financial problem relating to its balance sheet. Now, the operational problem, as I wrote millions of times, it started in the multiple plant failures started after 2018 when the sixth administration started, and within 2 weeks they appointed a board. That is when the multiple plant failures started. Now, let me just say the 6 years of darkness, 6 years from 2018 to 2023, under the previous administration, the sixth administration, they account for 95% of the energy shed from 2007. So let us get out of our minds this thing that load shedding has been a constant throughout the last 15 years, because out of 9 years, there was zero load shedding. And there was a period from 2014 to 2015, 8 months, when a silo broke down at Majuba, where there was load shedding, but it was of a lower intensity than we see. So what we saw now on the operational side, and the private sector can't claim credit for what has happened at Eskom. What we said is that what we're dealing with was a plant performance issue. It had nothing to do with the age of these plants. It was to do with the management that was clueless about how to manage these plants. Now, what has happened? The energy availability factor has gone up from 53 to 63%, and that has created more. Output from the Eskom, number one. Number two, demand is still low. And so the private sector can't claim credit for this turnaround of Eskom. I think it's completely wrong. We have engineers at Eskom who know what they're doing now, which wasn't the situation, number one. Number two, the finance one, to John Steenhuisen's point. I just want to, look at the whole issue. People need to understand is that from 2007 to 2023, the government spent 725 billion rand on its capital build program, the Eskom. Now, in some years, let me just give you some of these figures. In the first year, 2007, it was 44% of its revenues, 56% of its revenues in the second year, 82% of its revenues in the third year, and 69. So Eskom did not have any money the government hadn't created a financing mechanism for this build program. So what I'm saying is that we should not call it a bailout. The government must invest in its own company. So it is not a bailout. And there are many reports that came out at the time that Bobby Gottsell, in the 2008 annual report, he says we won't be able to pay for this bail out, the biggest in a generation. So the government must come to the party. This is the chairman in the 2008, and the government didn't come to the party. So all we're seeing now is that the government, I started writing about the need to fix the Transnet, the Eskom balance sheet in 2018. The government has blatantly done that. What I'm arguing with, Cathy, is that the entire debt of Eskom, the government must address it and make it go. Number two, I believe in the public option for Eskom. I believe that government must set aside about 2% of GDP every year to be given to the infrastructure, the increase of new capacity for Eskom. I don't believe in the IPPs. I don't believe they're a solution, the private sector model, because it's going to result in, huge costs for us consumers. And then the second thing I want to say is that the whole issue of the price of electricity with this private sector cost recovery model, these electricity prices are unaffordable for even middle-class South Africans. So I believe that there has to be a subsidy in terms of, this is the cost of this liberalization. There has to be a subsidy for households to pay this electricity bill, and various civil society recommendations have been made that there should be subsidies for, I think, 350 there's different proposals out there in civil society. So the government has to pay, number one, to subsidize this electricity. Number one, the first thing they have to do is that they have to bring these cost increases to the inflation rate, number one. They have to pay the difference between the NERSA price determination and the inflation rate. Number two, they have to subsidize these electricity prices. So there's three things we have to do. We have to build new capacity over the next 10 years, 15 years for the transition. Number two, we have to, the government must pay the difference between the NERSA price determination and the inflation rate. And number three, there must be subsidies for the poor in terms of this. And
very briefly, how must all of that be funded?
Yes. Okay. So now this is the bizarre statement that I heard from the deputy president. Okay. So the issue is that there's so many ways that we can fund it. So I'll start firstly. We have a central bank. a central bank can finance economic development, no matter what people say. That's number one. Number two, we have what I call the SA Inc. balance sheet. We've got assets of about 4 trillion rands in the Public Investment Corporation, and we've got foreign exchange reserves of about 1.2 trillion. And in the budget in March, we had about 150 billion rands. So these are assets of about 5. So now let me just give you an example. At the Government Employees Pension Fund.
Okay, Duma, I'm going to pause you there. I'm going to pause you there. It's edging towards 10:30 in time for the latest news headlines. We'll continue with Duma and Dale after this.
Good morning. In the headlines, more South Africans as well as business are confident in the direction the country is taking, which is good news for job creation and economic growth. This is according to President Cyril Ramaphosa in his letter to the nation today. Socio-political movement Operation Dudula says they're not against foreign nationals, they are against unlawfulness. The organization has been vying to close down foreign-owned spaza shops in local communities following the death of 6 children in Naledi, Soweto. And political analyst Livian Doe says the newly elected Tshwane Mayoral Committee is a fair representation of all the different parties. This after Tshwane's newly elected mayor, Dr. Nosipi Moya, announced a new mayoral committee yesterday. Details on these and other stories at 11.
Taking a look at your markets this morning, the rand is currently trading at 17 rand 41 to the dollar, 22 rand 75 to the pound, and 19 rand 02 to the euro. Markets in Asia were mostly positive at the closing bell. The JSE higher in mid-morning trade. Markets in Europe are mainly firm at this hour. Gold is trading at $2,662, platinum $979 per ounce. The price of Brent crude oil is at $77.71 a barrel.
And we went on a water safari, and Mom spotted a hippo, and it said, "Grrr."
There is a place where you can see wonder and the wild, with breathtaking scenery and endless landscapes. Enjoy good food and embrace great taste.
And the next day we went to the Reed dance. I saw the maidens handing over reeds to the mighty Zulu king, and the Zulu warriors chanting, "Bayede."
Explore all this and more in the magical Zulu Kingdom.
This message is brought to you by KZN Tourism and Film Authority.
If you think you cannot afford a lawyer, think again. Clientele Legal has made professional legal services affordable for you. Whether it's a civil, criminal, or labor-related matter, we have a nationwide panel of attorneys standing by to assist you. SMS SAFM to 32195. That's SAFM to 32195 and we'll call you back. Clientele General is a licensed non-life insurer and an authorized FSP. Standard rates and terms and conditions apply.
South African Airways is expanding in the DRC. We now offer direct flights from Johannesburg to Lubumbashi, the heart of the DRC's mining hub. Our convenient arrival time allows seamless connections to key regions like Ndola and the Copper Belt, opening up new growth opportunities. Traders can benefit from our generous baggage allowance, while SAA's superior aircraft belly capacity ensures your cargo reaches most parts of Congo on the same day. Book now at flysaa.com or contact your travel agent. South African Airways, connecting Africa to the world, one flight at a time.
Cathy Mohlahlana on SAFM.
We continue the conversation on the talking point. We're looking at the state of our SOEs and what then the future of these entities will look like, especially within the context of a government of national unity. And it follows the statements made on Friday, unequivocal statements by the DA's leader, John Steenhuisen, that it will not be supporting any further financial injections in the form of bailouts in these entities. Joining me on the line, Duma Qubule, independent economist, and Dr. Dane McKilney is an independent writer and political analyst based at the International Labour Research and Information Group. So, Duma, I'm just going to give you just a little bit of time then to conclude your reflections, especially when it comes to where you think government could be finding the money to further fund these SOEs. You say 2% of GDP on a year-on-year basis should be allocated towards SOEs, but mostly in infrastructure spend. If I'm quoting you correctly,
I say that let's just remember that after 1994, there was a direct allocation to Eskom to do electrification. It came from the government, and Eskom got a grant from the government to do the electrification. So I'm saying because we have to first address the balance sheet of Eskom and make sure that the debt disappears so it gets room to invest in its infrastructure. And then secondly, there will probably be a need for the government to pay, I'm talking about Eskom specifically, to pay addition to that to support the expansion of new capacity. The second thing, I was talking about the paying of it, So I said, first of all, the central bank. Number two, the central bank can create money for public purpose. That's a fact. It happened during COVID. 75% of the stimulus packages that happened in the wake of COVID were financed by central banks. And the stimulus packages globally were about 17 trillion rands. And whether it was the US Fed or the Bank of England or, all the major central banks, they paid towards government spending. Number two, I say we should restructure the SA Inc. balance sheet. Now, in 2016, a think tank called TIPS, Trade and Industry Policy Strategies, came up with a proposal that the UIF had a surplus of more than 100 billion rand at the time. And they said a part of the surplus must be used to a stimulus to the economy. Now, come COVID, the government created 60 billion rands out of thin air from this UIF surplus to pay 13 million people who were temporarily unemployed. Now, in that kitty, there's still 110 billion rands. Number two, the government employees pension fund has accumulated surpluses of almost 600 billion rand over the past 11 years, about more than 50 billion rands a year. There is no need for the surplus of about 600 billion rand. The GIPF has got excess funding of about 400 billion rand above the target set by the trustees. So what I'm trying to say is that between the UIF and the GEPF, there are massive surpluses that we can release into the economy. I just have to say the PIC, which manages those two institutions, the government already owes about 800 billion rands between the SOEs and the central government towards the PIC. And there's no reason why these, you must remember that the PIC is almost like a South African sovereign wealth fund, well, it should be seen in a similar way. And it must serve national purpose in the same way that the central bank must serve national purpose. So we have come up with, that's what I'm trying to say.
All right. Well, I don't know if people will agree with that view that the PSC should be seen as South Africa's sovereign wealth fund. Dale, perhaps to come back again to the issue then of what the likely funding of these SOEs is going to be going forward, especially when you have the kind of partners we do under the GNU that will obviously be incredibly opposed in terms of how they see what should happen with these SOEs.
Yeah, I think we need to I wanted to revisit a couple of things that Duma mentioned, because I think that we have to get this history correct.
Please do.
And that is this goes all the way back to the late 1990s with the early mid 1990s with the introduction of gear, and the privatization and liberalization agenda that began to affect state-owned enterprises and lack of investment in the early 2000s, way before even the state capture years and other things. This was a process that was in motion. There was a slow process motion that was inevitable. It was exacerbated particularly during the administration of President Zuma, and we have to say this very directly, by a situation in which those who were managing and those who were running the show didn't really care about what the delivery was, nor about if you have a house and you don't maintain the house for 10 years, it's going to break down after the 10 years. But you can't blame those that take possession of the house after the 10 years. You have to look at the entire entity of what the building of that house and the maintenance of it. And I think in that case, the fundamental issue here is we can talk about money. We can talk about sources of money and sources of financing. Duma's mentioned some of them in relation to the central bank and the GEPF, but if you don't have the right people in the right places, then it's going to be money down the drain again. because you can throw lots and lots of money into infrastructure and everything, but if it's not managed properly, if it's not accounted for properly, if it's not oversight, and this is the problem. If you've noticed that all of this in the state-owned enterprises, in terms of who was responsible for what and who was being accountable, it was politicians predominantly that were running the show, and centralized, and more power within the executive, more and more power within ministerial positions. And this basically goes fundamentally against a democratic accountability. So the fundamental problem, and we've seen this globally, is that when you run down public enterprises as a result of bad governance and corruption and mismanagement and your lack of public sector, then you set the scene for privatization. You set the scene for all of the arguments that are coming from the DA and all of the others that say, of course, you see, government can't do these things, public sector is going to mess it up again, and so forth and so on. So if people who want to make a defense of the public sector, which I do as well, I'm sure as Duma does, we have to take seriously the issue of governance. And governance is a fundamental problem, because it's not just a question of money. We are a very wealthy country. We have lots of, for example, if we were to raise the corporate tax rate by another 5%, which wouldn't even get us back to half of where we were 25 years ago, the amount of money that could be made available for all sorts of investment would be quite substantial. But the question is, how is that money going to be used? So I would go back to the fundamental point. You're talking about the GNU. We're in a new situation. The ANC can't call the shots anymore. It can't just say, we're going to do this. It's got to basically make compromises. And in this context, those compromises are going to have to involve a whole range of different things to convince ordinary people that you're not just going to throw more money at the situation. You're not just going to create a situation where you say you're going to invest these things, but you're going to do it in a way that is accountable, that people can see where the money is going, that they can see the impact and effect of those things. Some of these things are beginning to happen to some degree, I think. You mentioned a couple of the indications, but I think it's much more, it's a combination. It's not just a technical fiscal exercise. It's a fundamental about the right people in the right place doing the right things. And in that context, that's why I said it's about as much about democracy as it is about the economy. Because if we as a citizenry and as others do not demand and constantly pressurize our state and our representatives, whatever political party they're from, to do these kinds of things, they're going to run on their own. They're going to do it according to their own party interest and according to their own class interest. That's what's been happening for the last 25, 30 years. And that's what's got to change. So we can have a balance sheet, we can do these other kinds of things, but if we don't fundamentally begin to shift that political accountability, we're going to find ourselves having the same conversation in another 5 years.
Dale, one of the things that I recall is really strong messaging from government, and again, perhaps towards the end of the fifth administration, around re-evaluating the role of these SOEs and then having to check, which ones are still fit for purpose, which ones need to be closed down, restructured. There seemed to be quite a lot of talk around it. But it dissipated, not much came of it. Does that still matter? The fact that we have so many of these SOEs that are, of course, taking money out of the fiscus, and yet what you raise about not having the right people sometimes in the right jobs, it speaks to efficiencies of these entities. But ultimately, it's taxpayer money that is being used to fund them.
Sure, and I think there's certain things that, if you remember, we inherited, in the post-apartheid government inherited a maze of state-owned enterprises that the apartheid state had put into place to service a particular sector of the population. Now, obviously, the theory was that we're going to make use of those for the majority of the population. So, these 700 and something state-owned enterprises or publicly owned enterprises, there's definitely not they need to be repurposed, and some of them need to be localized. So there's no written rule that a state-owned enterprise has to be run by the national state and has to be centralized, and you have to have a central bureaucracy. We can be localizing certain kinds of public services down to the. We've done that on a whole range of other competencies in our Constitution. Why state-owned enterprises? Why is it that they've become just simply a cash cow in many cases for those who want to take care of their buddies and basically create jobs for themselves? So I think in that case, yes, the situation is we need a priority list. What are the priorities of this economy? What do we fundamentally need to grow this economy, to create productive opportunities, to grow local economies, to support small and medium scale enterprises, to get back to a situation where you're building an economy from the bottom up? What do we need on that? We need transport. We need logistics. We need ports. We need all of these. Let's make those priorities. You invest in those priorities. The ones that are not prioritized, you push you push and you localize those things. And in some cases, if they're not necessary and if they're simply a drain on the fiscus and they're not really serving any particular public purpose, then just get rid of them. In that case, and there's no written rule that every single thing has to be a state-owned enterprise simply because it's in law or it says it is. It's a question of its usefulness and its utility to the public sector. And I think that's where we have not had any kind of real political leadership, is in saying this is what we need, this is how we're going to do it, we're going to set out a plan, this is how the investment is going to happen, here's our governance plan, and this is how we're going to report on it and account for it. If we begin to have that, and if the GNU can begin at least to put in place some degree, even though they're going to disagree on all the modalities, if they can begin to put in some degree of that, then we'll be moving forward. But I think, again, what we tend to do in this country is we tend to have conversations in silos, and we tend to treat different things in different ways as looking at the state-owned enterprise as a holistic thing that needs a range of different interventions and a political leadership that's willing to drive that program.
All right, in a moment, I'm going to be bringing in the perspectives of our listeners to this conversation. On the question of investment versus bailout and how we view either, Duma, you've already made a strong case for why you believe that government should be funding these entities anyway, and that how we see it should not really be in the form of a bailout. But how do we determine if this is actually money that should be spent on these entities? Again, going back to the issue that Dale has raised. In the context of South Africa, malfeasance and misspending have become one of the biggest inhibitors to efficiency, whether we're looking at it from the point of SOEs or even from a governance point of view.
Okay, so now let me just start with some of the things that Gail said. Number one, I think what he explained perfectly how, or I think it was you, Cathy, the DA has a veto on economic policy. So the people who decided to go into this government of neoliberal unity, they must acknowledge that with this DA-ANC coalition, there's a veto, effective veto on economic policy. So the DA will say, we should not invest in our own assets, therefore we must privatize everything. That is the agenda. And as Dale was correctly saying, this started long ago with GEAR, the privatization, the liberalization. It was a slow process. Where I do not agree with him is that if you look at the technical indicators on the ESCOM annual reports, there was maintenance being done. And by 2018, the indicators were very good in terms of plant performance. The collapse, so it's not like they didn't maintain it. All the maintenance indicators, and I looked at them, it's basically the wrong kind of maintenance that was happening after 2018. So the plants were performing in 2018 with the EAF of 78%. It went as high as above 80% during that period. So I don't think it's that, yeah. And then in terms of governance, people do say, okay, we agree with you, Duma, the government must invest in its people and infrastructure. So the governance, during the New Deal under Roosevelt, they set up these things called alphabet agencies that were supposed to spend the money of the New Deal. So I've been talking to many people in South Africa that maybe we should set up something similar, because we can't, this sihulekile idea, just give everything to the private sector. We must fight for a public sector that works. But in the short term, because this public sector hasn't got any credibility, and we must remember that the loss of credibility in the public sector is due to these austerity policies, because the government stopped spending on its infrastructure. It's not, and our cities are collapsing anyway, everywhere, whether it's Pretoria, everywhere it's collapsing. So I'm saying we need a new institutional framework. For example, we would need infrastructure. We need to have different infrastructure commission. We need to have a new governance framework that has a quasi-public institution that has got public-private community participation. For example, let's just say the one that I believe strongly in is that we need to merge our 3 public employment programs. There's about 5 public employment programs in our country. So we merge them and we create a new quasi-public institution with professional management and civil society oversight.
Okay.
So, so I'm just saying we need to innovate in terms of the thing. And we need to introduce, for example, stakeholder boards and so forth. And the last thing I want to say, because last week I was at SABC talking to the executives at SABC, and I can tell you right now, no matter who is running SABC, the government must fund the public mandate. The public mandate, you cannot commercialize the public mandate and monetize it. So no matter how efficient you're running SABC, the government can't get away with funding. What is it, 100 million rand it provides to the SABC? The public mandate is about 1.7 billion. And also at the same time, the license fees were collecting 600 million. So the same issue, so we must separate the developmental and the commercial aspects of this. Okay. And if you separate, it must be quite transparent, and we must know what we are paying for. That's all I'm saying.
All right. Thanks for that, Duma. Dale, do you agree? I'm going to ask you the same question, right, about the perspectives then that we have. Is it government investment? Is it bailouts? And do you support what the DA is saying, that no more money out of government's purse, effectively that is beyond the budget allocations, should be spent on these entities?
No. I think the DA is playing to its particular political program, and it's confusing. I think Doom is correct there. It's confusing bailouts with proper investment. But the question that has to be answered by those who want public investment and who want to pour money in is investment for what? Investment how managed? Reporting on how. In other words, what we have is a crisis of, as I said, a crisis of governance and accountability that parallels the crisis of financial, sort of management and the availability of public funds. So it's not so much, for example, let's just engage this, because it's a question. You can say austerity politics. That's fine. We know austerity politics has become dominant, but you don't blame the policy itself. You look at who is implementing that policy and why they're implementing that policy. For what particular interests are they implementing that policy? So if you want to privatize and you want to commercialize, well, it's going to obviously benefit private capital for the most part. However, there are many countries, including in ours, where you don't want to necessarily privatize and you want to sell it off, but you want to corporatize it. You want to turn it into a corporation. You want to keep government ownership, but you want to basically ensure that most of the money is flowing to the people that you want it to flow to, and it's not going to benefit necessarily the public. So this is an ideological issue as well. It's not simply just a policy issue. That if we have austerity politics comes out of a particular understanding, the government must get out of the picture, that the market it's a neoliberal kind of thing. So, but the problem is that those who claim that they are pro-poor, like in the ANC and government, have been the ones that have been implementing the very neoliberal policies that now they want to blame the DA for. And this is the problem, is this government of national unity is not simply about the People's Party getting in bed with the neoliberal party. It's two neoliberal parties getting in bed with each other. And so the ANC in this case has been part and parcel of creating this crisis, and now you cannot then step back and say, well, we're going to blame the DA, because we know what the DA wants. We know they want to privatize everything. We know they want the markets to take over. That's fairly clear. What the question is there anyone in the ANC or in the other parties that is fundamentally really dedicated to a public service, to doing the kinds of things that Duma mentioned, about putting in all of these checks and balances? I'm not convinced that that's the case, and therefore I don't think the GNU is really going to be able to deal with this, because they're going to be arguing ideologically whose plan is better than what, and they're probably going to be able to change a few little things. But fundamentally, we need a systemic reevaluation of the way these not only state-owned enterprises, but how we build an economy. And that's going to take political change. We do not have that yet, but we're on the road. So watch the space for what comes after the GNU, because that's going to tell us whether or not we're going to move in the direction that we're talking about, or whether we're going to go backwards.
All right. Dale, thank you for that view. Let me bring in some of our listeners, a couple of voice notes, and then I'll take in some callers as well.
Good morning, Cathy. Do we really need a holding company? I mean, we have an auditor general in this country. And the job of the Auditor General is to assess the financial statements of state-owned enterprises. And it is the recommendations of the Auditor General that are important. So it is those recommendations that the President must take into consideration and fix state-owned enterprises according to what the Auditor General is saying. So this holding company is nothing but an ANC scheme to give positions of power to the people who supported the President in these elections and to the people who continue to support the new President in elections to come. Thanks, Lionel Whitbank.
Good morning, Cathy. And indeed, we must take a leaf from how apartheid conducted its business around the SOEs. Well, obviously, minus the negative things, such as the slave labor provided by black people, and this SOEs serving the minority rather than the majority. They were not expected to make profits in the first place. They didn't have to worry about profits. There was a constant bailout from the fiscus, directly from the fiscus. Let us use these SOEs for developmental purposes. SAA, for instance, is crucial for facilitating for tourism, business development, and the training of black pilots, technicians, and what have you. So all the other SOEs must be purposed around that, including, and crucially so, the development of business and black people in general.
All right, thanks for that. Temba in KZN, good morning.
Very good morning to you. Thanks for taking my call. Very good morning to those gentlemen there. Mr. Kubula and the gentlemen, they're on point. If you've got a soccer team, number 9, maybe number 12, they're not playing properly, the team is going to lose. So the ANC government is keep on failing us big time. Remember, there was the railway, it was run by the government. There was a train, there was a truck, there was a goods train. We used to call it a pullman. That was a bus. And when you look at post office, what happened to ports? What happened to school? What happened to hospital? Each and everything they've got, they touch is destroyed. Besides that, there is somebody, ANC leaders, they're working for. Those people that are controlling ANC. We vote, then after when we vote, the economics or whatever, the people running a business, they decide our future. ANC, one day God is going to punish them big time for exploiting us like this. Bye-bye.
Okay, Temba out in KZN, that's his view there. Maybe then as we get ready to wrap up the conversation, bring it back to our guests. Dale, I'm now, outside of the political posturing, I'm now less convinced that we're going to see anything fundamentally different in terms of outcomes from the SOEs than before, following this conversation with you and Duma, whose differences, by the way, very nuanced, but you're both highlighting what I think will perhaps be what keeps us in this cycle of performance from the SOEs as we've experienced over the years.
Yeah, Cathy. I think we're in an interregnum in some ways. That what this GNU represents. It represents a political shift, as we've seen for the first time in 30 years, the loss of majority of the ruling party, a situation where people are not sure of how to go about doing this kind of coalition politics and so forth. And yet nobody really can take complete control in this case. And in a situation economically where not only in South Africa, but globally, we're in a time of austerity politics, of sort of doubling down on this notion that, the private sector and everything can save us from everything. And the DA is going to champion that in this GNU. So I think what we're going to have is we're going to have quite a lot of sort of playground politics playing themselves out. But my hope is that irrespective of all of our critiques of the GNU and its shortcomings and everything else, is that that might be the silver lining is that precisely because there's no predictability, political predictability, and people are going to be looking to the next local government elections, there will be more responsiveness. There will be an attempt to try to make things a little bit better or run a little bit better, or at least improve some aspects of things. It's not going to sort out the problem of public enterprise. It's not going to sort out our economic and inequality issues. But what it could do is could lay some degrees of foundation for what could politically be coming in the next years, which is an understanding, and I think for the majority of South Africans, of a return to a governance and a politics which prioritizes the public, which prioritizes a state that runs for the people itself, not for a particular class, not for a particular party. And I think what we're doing is we're in a situation where that is beginning to to sort of, how should we say, imprint itself politically and economically, but we haven't gotten there yet. So I think what we're going to expect in the next 5 years is we should maybe some improvements, but not very many. Whereas, in fact, the systemic issues are going to get more and more. I mean, just look at our own city here where I live in Johannesburg with the water issues. When they turn on your taps, when everybody turns on their taps in 10 days and can get a little bit of water, you know that there's got to be some changes around the corner.
All right.
And I think that in the context is going to be the sort of more silver lining. Yeah.
Duma, your parting shot?
I agree with you, Cathy. Nothing different. The economic crisis of 47% unemployment amongst Africans and 50.4% amongst African females, nothing is going to change with this DA-ANC coalition. And I even object to calling it a GNU because it is just a coalition between these two, a right-wing coalition. There is no redeeming factor. I disagree with Dale. There's nothing positive that's going to come out of it. There has to be an alternative from below towards this thing. And I pray every day that this abomination of a coalition collapses here.
Could you have found any stronger adjectives, Duma? I feel like you weren't trying hard enough there.
Thank you.
Dr. Dale McKinley, independent writer and political analyst based at International Labour Research and Information Group. And you heard there, Duma Kobule, independent economist, certainly not mincing his words on that particular issue. It is 11 o'clock, time for the latest news update.
The 2024 Health Excellence Awards, hosted by Cliniques Health Group and the South African Clinician Scientist Society, is calling for nominations. This is your chance to recognize exceptional doctors, specialists, and medical professionals who are making an impact. The celebration of the 4th Annual Health Excellence Awards will take place on 16 November 2024 at Emperor's Palace in Johannesburg. Visit www.healthexcellenceawards.co.za to enter your nomination before 20 October 2024.
The Red Devils are well aware that the only way to find the path to the top is to ensure they triumph against Brentford.
And so close from Casemiro.
However, the visitors are confident that the Bees will be all over at Old Trafford.
West Ham struggling to get out of Bumo. They've done it again! Another goal inside the opening minute. How do they keep doing it?
This is the Premier League. Do not miss out on thrilling action between Manchester United FC and Brentford FC on Saturday, 19 October at 3:30 p.m. live on SABC3. Also available everywhere for everyone, always on SABC Plus and SABCSport.com. Proudly brought to you by SABC Sport. For the love of the game.
The top stories this hour, Ramaphosa reflects on the GNU and analysts weigh in on the Tshwane Mayoral Committee. A very good morning to you. More South Africans as well as business are confident in the direction that the country is taking, which is good news for job creation and economic growth. This is according to President Cyril Ramaphosa in his letter to the nation today. The president says that the improved sentiment is informed by the effective transition to the GNU, which enjoys wide support across society and progress in addressing the challenges such as those in the energy and the transport sectors. Busi Chimombe reports.
Improved citizen and business confidence in the country's growth prospects must be harnessed to make a real difference in the lives of South Africans, according to President Cyril Ramaphosa. He says improved investment sentiment will improve the country's fiscus, allow for increased expenditure on infrastructure and social services, and create more jobs and opportunities. The President says that a firm foundation for growth has been laid by the GNU, and the country is headed in the right direction. Busi Chimombe, SABC News.
Business Unity SA CEO Cas Kuvadia has paid tribute to his friend and former finance minister Tito Mboweni. Kuvadia says Mboweni will be remembered for his forward thinking in developing economies, but also for his genuine heart for the people. Mboweni, who was also notably a former Reserve Bank governor, passed away on Saturday after a short illness at a Joburg hospital. Kuvadia says the news came as a shock to him as he met with a healthy-looking Mboweni just 2 months ago.
last time I saw Tito, which was probably about 2 months ago or so, he was what Tito always is, gregarious, normal, friendly, and no sign of any illness. So it's a shock that it's very sudden, certainly from what I know. And, I knew Tito from the days he came back from exile, and he was a very, very important part of the ANC. He made a significant impact there, and as First Minister of Labour at a time when the country had to ensure that we have labour laws that are fair and we treat workers well. He excelled as Minister of Finance and Governor of the Reserve Bank.
Police in Mpumalanga are investigating the tragic death of a 16-year-old boy who is believed to have fallen from a cliff while hunting in Masoyi over the weekend. The deceased was with another 12-year-old who sustained injuries and is currently in hospital. It's believed that the boys went hunting on Saturday when they didn't return. The community and the Community Policing Forum then launched a manhunt. Socio-political movement Operation Dudula says they're not against foreign nationals, but they are against unlawfulness. The organization has been vowing to close down foreign-owned spaza shop in local communities following the death of 6 children in Naledi, Soweto. This has been criticized for being insightful and xenophobic. But the organization's president, Zandile Daula, refutes this. She says they just want spaza shops to follow all the processes legally.
But we are not against foreign nationals. We're just against the illegality. We're not against legal foreigners that are here on purpose. If you're here to work, you need to have your work permits and have proper documentation. If you're here to do business, you need to have your business visa, have a proper document, and invest the minimum of 5 million to do business. So we just need this country, because we have laws in this country. People must just respect it, because when we go to their countries, we do the same. We respect them.
And analysts say that the newly elected Tshwane Mayoral Committee is a fair representation of all the different parties. This after Tshwane's newly elected mayor, Nasipi Moya, announced her new mayoral committee yesterday. The multi-party coalition comprises of the Action SA, the EFF, the ANC, and the Good Party. Amongst the portfolios appointed, MMC for Housing and Settlements is Aaron Maluleke from the ANC, Economic Development to Sarah Mabotsa from the Good Party, the Health MC is Tsegofatso Mashabela from the EFF, and Community Safety is Alderman Kotier of Action SA. Political analyst Levin Doe.
It also reflects what appears to be a proportional representation, especially having looked at the performance of these parties during the elections. But the overall winner in this whole exercise is the Action SA and the ANC. Action SA's mission to ensure that the GA is removed from power as bad fruits, and that is what they plan to do.
The top story this hour, President Cyril Ramaphosa says more South Africans as well as business are confident in the direction that the country is taking, which is good news for job creation and economic growth. For SAFM News, Gemudupi Makhaleme.
SAFM values your views. Be an active citizen.
The 2024 Health Excellence Awards, hosted by Cliniques Health Group and the South African Clinician Scientist Society, is calling for nominations. This is your chance to recognize exceptional doctors, specialists, and medical professionals who are making an impact. The celebration of the 4th Annual Health Excellence Awards will take place on 16 November 2024 at Emperor's Palace in Johannesburg. Visit www.healthexcellenceawards.co.za to enter your nomination before 20 October 2024.
The Wild Beasts are searching for a massive win against Morocco, but the Atlas Lions want to demonstrate that they are ready to host the Africa Cup of Nations. This is the Total Energies AFCON 2025 qualifier. Experience the spectacular journey to AFCON 2025. Central African Republic versus Morocco on Tuesday, 15 October at 9 p.m. Live on SABC Sport on DTT Channel 4. Also available everywhere for everyone, always on SABC Plus and SABCSport.com. Proudly brought to you by SABC Sport.
For the love of the game.
Talking Point with Cathy Mohlahlana. Weekdays, 9 a.m. till midday.
In regard to the bailing out of SOEs for such huge amount of money, the different ministers of finance have been complaining about this. Unfortunately, they were just forced to do that. And also the even the late Mr. Mboyen as well has been against it. I remember when we were saying that if South African Airways continues not to manage itself properly financially, then let the aeroplanes stop, and then let's go for privatization of these aeroplanes and so on. Thanks, William Kuma.
Good day, Cathy and the listeners. The position of the newly elected mayor at Tshwane looks precisely the same like that one of Kabelo Kwamanda, a minority party giving mayoralship. A similar thing is happening in Ditsobotla. There's a mayor here who has got 2 seats. He's a mayor. Nothing happens. We are now gunning for 2 years. Our garbages are not being collected because we are under Ngaka Mudiri Molema, where the district mayor does not want to talk to SABC or any other broadcasting house. Anonymous, Ditsobotla.
Siskati, hi, well, this is Jesse K. from Sina. Siskati, there's something that is not getting down well with me. It's about time government do the right thing and honor the legends while they're still alive. What's the use to honor her or him when one is no more? Time to honor them when they are alive so that they can appreciate. Aye, man, this is the old fashion of honoring people when they're dead. Honor them now. Maybe government must just wake up, man. Let me rest my case for now. Bratito, rest in our hearts. Rest in our hearts, Bratito. Signing off, JCK from Sina.
The Talking Point with Cathy Mohlahlana. Weekdays, 9 a.m. till midday.
While we continue the conversation on the Talking Point for this hour, we are unpacking a study by the South African Medical Research Council. It unpacks gender-based violence, in particular, looking at the COVID-19 area and really trying to unpack some of the violence that we saw during that period. Let me welcome onto the show Dr. Leanne Ramsuma Haripasad, public health researcher and research uptake specialist at the South African Medical Research Council. Good morning, Leanne.
Good morning, Cathy, and good morning to your listeners.
Dr. Nwabisa Shai is a specialist scientist, public health at the South African Medical Research Council. Nwabisa, good morning.
Good morning, Cathy, and good morning to your listeners.
Firstly, looking into just some of the data that you've put together in this report, we deal with reporting on gender-based violence, on violence in this country on a daily basis. And I would say that to some extent we've almost become somewhat desensitized to the levels of violence that take place. But certainly reading just what you have found in terms of violence that has already occurred, it was quite chilling for me because it does paint a very vivid picture of just how deep and just how destructive the violence that we have against the violence that we have that is perpetuated against women, just how serious an issue it is and it should be. Leanne?
Thanks, Cathy. That's right. I think violence against women, also referred to as gender-based violence, has become normative in South Africa. In the world, and in particular in South Africa, we're concerned, and in this particular report have looked at not just gender-based violence, which is on the one end of the continuum, but also the most extreme form of gender-based violence, which is femicide. And our report has been launched for the 2020-2021 period, which was a period that overlapped with the COVID-19 period. But it is the fourth in a series of femicide surveillance studies that we've been doing since 1999. And we are not seeing an improvement in preventing particularly femicide in the context of a country where violence generally is normalized and gender-based violence in particular. So we're seeing this troubling persistence of GBV as well as the killing of women in this country.
Nwabisa, I want you to speak to us about some of the study methods that you embarked on in conducting the study? Because I see that there are particular definitions that you are also looking at. Leanne has touched on the issue of femicide and understanding that. But we also have intimate partner femicide and non-intimate partner femicide. How did you decide in fine-tuning these particular categories of violence, and also then how you went about conducting the research?
Thanks, Cathy. So in terms of being able to differentiate between different types of femicide, and I'll just mention three. So it's intimate partner femicide, which is a murder of a woman by an intimate partner who may be a current spouse or boyfriend, and this person may be same-sex or a rejected would-be partner, someone who's proposing love but is being rejected, and that would be for intimate partner femicides. And then there is non-partner femicides, who may include people who may be strangers or family members or acquaintances, people that are known to the women but they don't have an intimate relationship with them. And then we also look at evidence of sexual violence and coinciding with the woman being killed, which is also now leading us to an understanding of cases where we categorize as sexual femicides or rape femicides. And in terms of the methods that we have, that we conduct, so we've been using the same methodology throughout since the femicide studies began for the year 1999. And we have two approaches. So we first start with the medical legal services that we call mortuaries, where bodies of people who have been killed would have been stored and recorded on their documents, and when we identify women, females from the age of 14 years and above, and from that group, then we will take them through a system where they're recorded cases. We try and trace them with the police investigation, looking at case numbers. We try and find a way to link the case we have from the mortuary to a case number, and then we interview the police around each case that we have managed to select for our study. So what we try to do is to do a nationally representative approach to reaching the numbers that would help us to continue with the research. And the interviews that we do with the police give us a lot of other information that is that would not have been obtained, for instance, directly from the mortuary records.
Leanne, when we look at the figures from 1999 right through to 2020, one sees that overall femicide has been on the decline. However, intimate partner femicide has not been decreasing. In fact, it has been increasing. What do we understand to be some of the factors behind this? What's driving it?
Thanks, Cathy. That's quite right. I mean, we've seen an overall decline in femicide, particularly in the first decade, 1999 to 2009. What's trapped the rates of intimate partner femicide, as Nobisa explained, being killed by a partner, a lover, a husband, has increased. And I think there's a couple of risk factors that we need to consider. Number one is that there's often a history of violence in relationships, and this history of violence can happen over a period of months, years. So there's a very, very difficult, abusive relationship, and often that's a cyclical relationship. The second one is that we have to talk about the factors that place women at risk of being killed by a partner. Access to guns, for example. The role of alcohol, which showed up quite clearly in our data this time. And of course, the overarching and pervasive issue of patriarchy and a woman's vulnerability to the kinds of gender norms that really make them less valued, to the point that even their lives are less valued. So it's a complex picture where we have to start to think about what happens in the home, what are happening in relationships where there's so much of abuse, that abuse then escalates into a femicide, but also what are some of the key risk factors that are adding to that risk. And we've seen from this work, it's access to guns, it's alcohol, as well as just, I think, from a societal point of view, just a general sense of impunity for people who do perpetrate violence against women and femicide.
I'm looking at the breakdowns here, Nwabisa, across provinces, and struggling to find a connection between the Eastern Cape, which is one of the provinces that has recorded a significant increase in intimate partner femicide. A province like Gauteng also a significant increase in intimate partner femicide, but just an increase in femicide overall in Gauteng. What about these two provinces, would you say, has been a differentiating factor from the others that is driving again these numbers to the high levels that we are seeing?
So, Cathy, about the two provinces, we have yet to do in-depth analysis to understand the provincial effects and be definitive. But I will just say that what we've done, so we started looking at provincial data from the 2017 survey. But what we're seeing in the Eastern Cape, I think it also is a picture that is emerging about the use of violence that we've been seeing also covered in other types of violence in the country, which requires that we conduct an in-depth analysis over. But I think just wanting to emphasize what Leanne has already mentioned around the norms that make it possible for women to be seen as, as people who should be violated and abused, and the impunity with which they do that. And in setting a cultural context, it is possible that the cultural context makes it really acceptable, the use of violence against women, and that being normalized use of violence in general. But there are other factors that I think are skills that are needed to resolve conflict, which I think in certain contexts make it very difficult for women and ultimately leading to women being killed. There's also other aspects of the severity of violence, which now may coincide with other issues relating to the kind of socioeconomic status, food insecurity that is affecting our communities and so on. And we know of the overpopulation in Gauteng as well, which would probably affect the picture that we see on the extent of violence, particularly violence against women, and which now we are seeing its severe impact resulting in the femicides. But what I think is notable is that we do need to pay attention to this doubling of the rate of femicide that we're seeing in the Eastern Cape, and concerted effort is really needed to address the violence that we are seeing in general, but specifically the danger with which the danger that is women are experiencing in the province as well.
All right, we're going to continue this conversation in a moment after this quick break.
Catch the Tastemaster Junior this Tuesday evening at 7 on SABC2. With only 5 contestants left in the competition, the heat is on. This week, they must prepare a family feast with the help of a sous chef who also happens to be their parent. It's a big challenge, but the reward is even bigger. That's the Tastemaster Junior this Tuesday evening at 7. Repeat Wednesdays at 1 and Sundays at 4 p.m. Only on SABC2.
If you think you cannot afford a lawyer, Think again. Clientele Legal has made professional legal services affordable for you. Whether it's a civil, criminal, or labor-related matter, we have a nationwide panel of attorneys standing by to assist you. SMS SAFM to 32195. That's SAFM to 32195 and we'll call you back. Clientele General is a licensed non-life insurer and an authorized FSP. Standard rates and terms and conditions apply.
Congo Brazzaville wants to ensure that AFCON bronze medalist South Africa gets nothing during their visit to Brazzaville. However, Southern Africans Bafana Bafana want to represent the region well by collecting maximum points. This is the Total Energies AFCON 2025 qualifier. Experience the exciting journey to Morocco. Congo Brazzaville versus South Africa on Tuesday, 15 October at 6 p.m. Live on SABC3 and SABC radio stations. Also available everywhere for everyone. Always on SABC Plus and SABCSport.com. Proudly brought to you by SABC Sport.
For the love of the game.
The Talking Point with Cathy Mohlahlana. Weekdays, 9 a.m. till midday.
We continue the conversation looking at the Femicide Brief 2024, and it's really looking then, tracking femicide in the country, but this particular report zooming into a period that would have been under the COVID-19 pandemic. Dr. Leanne Ramsumaharipasad is one of our guests this morning. She is with the South African Medical Research Council, also joined by her colleague, Dr. Nwabisa Shai. I want to again stay with the findings of this report. And when we look under the topic of who perpetrates femicide, you see there that, family members, strangers account for, the smallest margins there. And then you have friends, acquaintances, other people. But it is incredibly alarming that you have intimate partners accounting for 60% of perpetrators of femicide. These are the people that have the most intimate knowledge about one's life, your schedule, and so for me it is particularly concerning that it is also these people, at least in 60% of cases, that are likely to be behind the killing of women, as we have seen under the COVID-19 pandemic. I'll give you both, Leanne and Nwabisa, an opportunity to reflect on what this aspect of the research is actually telling us.
Thanks, Cathy. That's right. I mean, I think that it's incredibly worrying that the people that are closest to us are the ones that actually are perpetrating violence. And I think on the one hand, something I alluded to earlier is often there is a long cycle of violence. There's a history of violence in a relationship, and a very few or limited opportunities for women to exit these relationships safely. And that too is based on a whole range of different reasons, such as economic dependence on the partner, partners' access to children, and some of the complexities of whether, for example, if there's a protection order that speaks and links with men's access to children, etc. Men also tend to weaponize children a lot in abusive relationships. So there's this complex picture where women find themselves trapped in these relationships for a long period of time. Another really important part is once you've been in an abusive relationship with someone for a long period of time, there's a couple of things that happen. One is what we call almost the Stockholm syndrome, where women start to believe that they can justify the ways the relationship is unfolding, and they become much more accepting of that violence over a period of time. One must understand that,
Hello, Leanne. All right, it looks like we've lost Leanne on the line there. We'll try to reconnect to her. But Nwabisa, perhaps you want to pick up where she left off.
Yes, I'd like to do that. So I think just carrying on with what she said, there's also the kind of value that is attached to women being in in intimate relationships, and just even, either being partnered or being married, and sometimes that value being used around our social norms to now speak to whether a woman is worth or a woman enough if she's in a relationship or she's maintaining and staying in that relationship. So some of those norms also influence what happens and what women endure in those relationships. But I think there's also the other elements, if we're remembering that the 60% of intimate partners being the ones that are perpetrators of femicide, also speaks to maybe the pressure that people were locked in with their abusers. And this is something that the global community of women's rights organizations and gender-based violence activists were raising alarm about, that the lockdowns that were being instituted by different governments at the time were increasing women's risk of being abused. And now we're seeing some of these findings showing these alarmingly high rates of intimate partner femicide during the COVID year, which is the latest release or addition to the release of our findings from the series of 20 years of research that we've done. And this really is, it just speaks to perhaps the confinement of women that they were undergoing, them being unable to access the help services perhaps that they would have been able to access on without the lockdown set up. There was also shelters being over capacity and unable to have intake of new clients, new women coming in who have left their homes from the abuse that they're experiencing. And so there's these multiple factors that influence this picture that we are seeing around intimate partners being perpetrators, the most perpetrators. Yeah.
Let's take the latest headlines and we'll continue with this conversation shortly.
A very good morning to you. With the news headlines this hour, Ke Mudupi Makhalemele. The acting judge president of the Western Cape High Court, Patricia Goliath, has sought to explain her leadership style before the JSC. President Cyril Ramaphosa says more South Africans as well as business are confident in the direction the country is taking, which is good news for job creation and economic growth. And Taiwan has condemned large-scale military drills by China surrounding the island, calling them irrational and provocative. Those are your headlines. A full news update midday.
Bridget Masinga on SAFM.
Let's talk also a little bit about being a male nurse. And I wonder, that must be a very unique experience, because firstly, when we think nurses, we don't really think male nurses have the same kind of nurturing.
I will tell you, and be honest with you, no guy said, when I finished school, I want to do nursing.
Yeah.
There was no guy who said that. All we said engineering, all those courses. Being a male nurse, I will tell you, me, I was recognized by my late grandmother. He said, when you end this destination, you'll be helping people at hospitals. So, for me, nurses, I cherish these things. But only to find out now, after all the struggle, I found myself in nursing.
Sakile is a nurse at Bara Hospital.
The Full Circle with Bridget Masinga, Monday to Friday, 1 to 3 p.m. SAFM has signed a code of conduct that is enforced by the Broadcasting Complaints Commission of South Africa. Under the code, we are committed to giving news that is accurate, comment that is fair, and programming that is not harmful, does not amount to hate speech, or contain violence or explicit sex. If you think we are not living up to that code, then you can inform the Broadcasting Complaints Commission of South Africa. Direct any complaints in writing to the Broadcasting Complaints Commission of South Africa. PO Box 142365. Craig Hall 2024. Fax to 011-326-3198 or an email to bccsa@nabsa.co.za. For more information, please visit www.bccsa.co.za.
The Talking Point with Cathy Mohlahlana. Weekdays, 9 a.m. till midday.
We continue with the show right here on the Talking Point, unpacking then the latest findings of the femicide brief for 2024. It tracks the levels of femicide across different areas of our society, and I mean this is within the provinces, but also it's a study that has been conducted over a series of years. So this is, we're looking at now 20 years of this particular report. Joining us on the line, Dr. Leanne Ramsuma Haripasad, who is a public health researcher and research uptake specialist at the South African Medical Research Council, and Dr. Nwabisa Shai, who is a specialist scientist, public health at the South African Medical Research Council. One of the things that has been raised in this conversation, and I'm not sure whether it was you, Leanne or Nwabisa, that spoke about the issue of conflict resolution skills and the need for people to be empowered with conflict resolution skills. It speaks to some comments that were made on the open line just when I mentioned that we would be conducting this interview. Some of our listeners, one in particular, spoke about provocation and how women provoke men and men feel that they're not protected within the law. And so this becomes then their way of responding to provocation. And he also went on to say that because there are, there isn't necessarily protection for men, then that there are no other ways in which this can unfold. Because the question I asked him is that, well, if you're in a heated situation, then why don't you walk away? Why is that not an option? In the interviews that you were conducting with the police around these killings, what did they have to say about the nature of conflict management and how they believed it also influenced what became the outcome, which is dealing now with the loss of life? Leanne?
Well, firstly, in our interviews with police, we didn't do deep dives into, sort of the motivating factors other than those that were required for the identification, classification of the case, etc.
Okay.
However, to address both your issue as well as the issue of, the issue raised by the listener, I think there's a couple of things to be said here. One is the fact that it is indeed true that men are also victims of gender-based violence. We see some of that through the work that we do. And so there's no denying that. I think the particular narrative that is being put forward, that in order to, when a man is provoked, that somehow it's much more justifiable for him to respond with violence rather than in some other non-violent way to resolve conflict. And as you said, why don't you just walk away? And I think this is deeply embedded in social norms and gender norms about how men think they should be resolving resolving conflict or resolving disputes, etc., in a relationship. This is also reflected in male homicide statistics we see in the country, because we see a very high rate of male homicide in the country. And what does it mean? That often violence is the first option in order to resolve conflict. And I think when Nwabisa spoke about teaching or beginning to get people to rethink how we resolve conflict in this country, it spans across the entire life cycle, from the way we socialize children to resolve conflict at home, the way parents do that with their children at school, and even in institutions. So I think we do need to move away from this idea that there is some sort of justification and that is the first resort. We've done a number of studies in other parts of the world as well, where a number of women themselves feel that it's okay to be beaten by a partner, because that has historically how it's been happening, and it's an entrenched norm that needs to be completely and utterly, challenged and absolutely eliminated. Then the final thing I want to say around that is the Domestic Violence Act in this country does provide the right for anyone whether that be male or female, to seek protection from an abusive relationship. That's applied to men and women equally. It applies in domestic relationships, it applies with neighborly relationships, family members, etc. So whether or not we're seeing men access the same levels of care that they are actually also entitled to, we're not entirely sure.
All right, I think that that's fair enough. I want to bring in some of the perspectives being shared by our listeners on this conversation.
Mm-hmm.
It's Cathy. I want to point out something. Every day, let me say every now and then when I hear these analysts, people who knows it all about this, GBV and all that stuff, not that it's wrong, but this is not a TV show, guys. Now we are living in it. It's not like we know what is happening. They don't come on the ground. We are not. We can never be statistics. We know what is happening around us. They don't come to the locations over the weekends. Come to the townships over the weekend. Go there to the rural places. I don't know where. It's happening. Well, I'm not denying it. It's happening, but they talk as if they know it all, and they don't want to get into the depth and come to the ground and speak to the people who are affected. All they know is they write books and all that stuff. It's like when you see people are talking about crime on TV. Those people who are committing crime, they don't even watch TV. They don't even care. Thank you, Sis Cathy.
Morning, Cathy. On the gender-based violence, I have a brother who was married, and the wife used to do all the provocations, like the previous caller was saying. The wife would provoke, like he actually was abusive. Like women do abuse men, and it is horrible. Like he went to the extent that it was beating my brother. And mind you, we're talking about someone who goes to gym. My brother goes to gym. The woman was as skinny as me, but then my brother didn't do anything. So I think even control works on that. But then the lady went to the extent of trying to stab my brother, and the police are not doing anything about it. I think we should have a law that protects men also from gender-based violence.
Good morning, Sis Cathy, and to the listeners. With regards to this topic of GBV, I believe that it's very important for us to take note of the image that we are portraying here when it comes to violence in South Africa. You know, the statistics, they say that men on men violence, it's still 4 times more than it is between men to women violence. The statistics, they still say that violence of women to children is still 4 times more than it is from men to children. So what does that say? Why are we making a racket about men to women violence when which South Africa on its own, it's a violent country, and we need to address it holistically instead of pointing one aspect that is just making news currently right now. This is George from Northwest.
Good morning, I'm from National. I just want to know if my decision that I made this weekend was fair in any way or just. Maybe not just, but or not fair, I don't know. But yeah, I came home and my wife told me about an incident that happened at the neighbors where there was physical abuse. She asked me to intervene. I said no. I will not, because I will not be one of those stories where the husband of the abuser gets sent to jail and there's no income for the wife and the children, and they are struggling because I intervened. There are so many stories like that. Instead of you as the person that called in the incident gets to say thank you, or get a thank you, no, you get abused verbally.
Sure. Some very diverse experiences, views coming through from our listeners. Nobisa?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very sad, I think, issues that your listeners brought up. So I'm just going to try and tackle a couple of them and then hand over perhaps to Leanne if she wants to add something. Look, the reason that we are concerned about gender-based violence is that when we are a medical research council, so our work is to look at health impacts and to try and improve the health status, especially the quality of life of women. That's the work that we are doing. And what we found is that gender is right at the crux of some of the factors that determine poor health, especially for women, and health inequalities. And we know the social position of women. Women historically did not have access to jobs, were considered as minors. And just quickly to say that I think the sooner as a community, as a society, we acknowledge that when we're looking at gender-based violence, we're looking at the fact that women are seen as subordinates of men. And if we acknowledge that is how the violence, for example, comes in. The woman who may be seen as not respecting the man feeling that he needs to exert his power and control over the woman. The sooner we acknowledge that, a lot of the work we've done shows that picture as the driving force, among other things, including, of course, food inequality, especially with women not having access to income, like Leanne mentioned. All of those things are what we have established, and we have been finding throughout the research that is justifying why we're focusing on women's violence, women's exposure to violence perpetrated by men. And that is it shows that men are mostly, would be using this power and control over their partners. So when you're looking at it in the context of, say, what happens over the weekends with the presence or without the presence of alcohol, some of it you will see that this power and control features. But I'll let Leanne speak to perhaps the alcohol element. I think we do need to, Leanne has already said that there is acknowledgement, even by law, under the Domestic Violence Act, that men do experience violence that is perpetrated by women. By the extent to which that is happening because of the power and control, that extent has not been established. Yes, we are seeing these anecdotal incidents, and it doesn't, and I'm not saying this to say that men are not being abused, are not emotionally abused, but I think key to this is that instead of competing for power in certain situations, it is best that we provide the skills either to resolve conflict, to get people to resolve conflict amicably, or to find a way to get out of those relationships, because they do turn violent and they can be fatal. I think I will stop there and maybe ask Leanne if she could speak about anything else around alcohol.
Leanne, I'm going to ask you to keep it as brief as possible for me, but go ahead.
Sure. I mean, I think Nwabisa has covered quite a number of things. We definitely acknowledge the impact of violence on men as well. I think, Cathy, for us as a society, we need to be very concerned about normalized levels of violence. Violence between the same genders, violence against, female genders, violence against people from the LGBTQI community. We focus, as Nwabisa said, on women, and women are disproportionately affected by gender-based violence and femicide across the world, and that is the area that we focus on as a unit. I also think that we must acknowledge the role of retaliatory violence. The act of violence means that one person is going to perpetrate it and the other person is going to defend themselves, and then there may be some retaliatory violence. And these are areas we need to begin to explore if we're going to really look at bringing down levels of all types of violence and gender-based violence in particular.
Let me thank you both for your perspectives on the show this morning. Leanne and Nwabisa, both of them doctors with the South African Medical Research Council. It brings us to the end of our show for this Monday morning. Of course, we're back with you again tomorrow between 9 and midday. Up next, the book reading.
The book reading. Please note that the views expressed in this book are not that of the station. Listeners' discretion is advised.
SAFM presents another episode of A Life of Purpose, written by Luvuyo Wochela and Lumkile Wiseman Kuhlu. The reader is Lerato Velase.
Central to Wiseman's development philosophy was the need to broaden access to capital for ordinary South Africans to engage in entrepreneurial activities. In that context, parallel to his involvement with the DBSA, he and a few colleagues took over the Bank of Transkei from Absa, rebranded and renamed it Meag Bank. Subsequently, the Meag Bank opened new branches in the former Transkei and the Ciskei. Wiseman's central role in the transformation of the DBSA continued up to August 2000, when he stepped down as chairman to attend to his many other commitments. There was also the invitation to join the presidency of Thabo Mbeki to serve as the economic advisor. J. Naidu, a charismatic leader and an activist during apartheid years, succeeded Wiseman as the DBSA chairman. Ian Golden also indicated his wish to move on after his contract ended in 2001. Wiseman, who was still intent on seeing that the DBSA retained its new vision and mandate, persuaded his protege, Mandla Gancho, who had in the meantime moved into a position with the International Finance Corporation in Washington, to return to South Africa to take up the position of CEO. Mandla Gancho accepted that challenge, and the DBSA entered the new millennium, committed to the triple role of financier, advisor, and partner that was initiated during the transformation under the chairmanship of Wiseman. Meanwhile, he had also started to challenge the long-established white-dominated South African Institute of Chartered Accountants, SAICA. It represented a profession and practice that was dear to him, and he was thus keen to see it transformed. Changes in the South African Institute of Chartered Accountants, SAICA. The first Institute of Accountants and Auditors in South Africa was established in 1894 in Johannesburg with about 65 members. This was the first professional institute of accountants, renamed the Transvaal Society of Accountants. It grew fast and led to the establishment of accounting societies in what used to be the Cape and Natal colonies, as well as in the Orange River area. The Joint Council of Societies of Chartered Accountants was established in 1945 to provide a forum for the different societies to interact, but it was not until 1966 that the National Council of Chartered Accountants cemented the unification process. It was only in 1980, when Wiseman had already qualified as a CA, that SAICA was formed. When Wiseman qualified as a chartered accountant in 1976, he joined the Cape Society of Chartered Accountants, the first initiative to expand the accounting profession beyond the white fraternity was launched in the mid-1980s by the Eden Trust, which focused on raising bursaries for the training of black CAs. Until then, and particularly during the 1960s and 70s, business, including the professions, had embraced and supported the empowerment of Afrikaners. Recognition of the need to empower blacks only emerged during the late 1970s and early 1980s with the formation of the Urban Foundation and the recognition of labor unions, and was largely a response to the intensification of the liberation struggle. A number of progressive leaders, including Harry Oppenheimer and Gavin Raleigh of Anglo-American, Mike Rochalt of Barlow Rand, John Marie of Netco, Mike Levette of Old Mutual, Bob Tucker, former chief executive of the Permanent Building Society, Chris Liebenberg of Netco, and Jan Steyn, a judge of the Supreme Court, who became the chairman of the Urban Foundation, led business in discourse about a future without apartheid. Leaders of major accountancy firms participated in the discourse, and this inevitably led to consideration about transforming the profession. The pace of change accelerated after 1994, with black firms becoming stronger and the Big Four intensified training and advancement of blacks in their own firms. Transformation in SAICA was integral to this process. As it turned out, Early in 1996, just as his role in DBSA's transformation reached its peak, Wiseman was invited to join the Council of SAICA as its vice president. The invitation surprised him initially because he had not yet served on the SAICA Council, even though he had been a member since the early 1980s. He believed that being resident in Transkei, far from the hub of SAICA's operations that had catered primarily for white CA's interest, had denied him the prospect. All the same, once the invitation came, he gladly welcomed the chance to contribute to the growth of a profession that had significantly molded his character and had opened great career opportunities for him. In addition to his Christian upbringing, his training as a CA had inculcated sound values that had guided him through his professional life. The profession had also enhanced his aptitude to process information, enabling him to take balanced decisions, and above all, it had helped him to become a better person. Accepting SAICA's invitation was not an easy decision, though. He was well aware that the Institute had not done much to transform its secretariat, nor had it done much to increase the number of black CAs. Many of his colleagues in Abasa, with whom he had shared the news of his invitation, were initially skeptical, believing, like Wiseman, that SAICA had yet to adhere to the principles and practices of transformation. Nevertheless, despite that skepticism, Wiseman thought his being part of the leadership of SAICA could provide the prospect of understanding its budgetary priorities and policies. Now that he was based in Johannesburg, he believed he could devote more time to such an activity, and thus he accepted the SAICA invitation. He was also aware that it was common practice at SAICA at the time for an individual to serve as the vice president before becoming a full president, so he could build his influence within SAICA and gradually gain control of its council. The prospect of influencing SAICA's budgetary policies and priorities was very important for him. Wiseman realized that in order to make his mark, he had to win the confidence of the prominent members of the SAICA Council. The president, Sylvan McFarlane, had good credentials in the accounting profession and was the chief financial officer of the South African breweries. In recognition of McFarlane's standing, Wiseman concentrated on winning him over. He also believed there were other progressive people within the council who would support his commitment to contributing to the growth in the number of black accountants. He had in the meantime introduced that philosophy to SAICA, and it had become part of their vision during the mid to late 1990s. Even so, he had to proceed cautiously because it was only in 1998 that he finally took over as president of SAICA, the first African chartered accountant to hold that position. For the next 2 years, Wiseman worked hard with fellow accountants and particularly with Sizwe Nxasana, who then was the president of Abasa, to recruit the first black chief executive officer for SAICA. Both preferred Ignatius Sehole for the position. Sehole, who was already a qualified CA, had studied at Vista University and UNISA and at Ashridge Management College in the United Kingdom. After completing articles with Deloitte and Touche, he worked briefly for Transnet, and in 1992, he started as a group internal audit manager with FedEx Food Services. A year later, he was promoted to General Manager Finance, and by 1994, he was appointed Operations Director. In 1996, when he was recruited by Wiseman to lead SAICA, he had already been appointed the Managing Director of FedEx Inland Region, overseeing well over 3,000 employees and more than 300 contracts. Yet, in spite of his impeccable credentials, Wiseman had to proceed with caution in persuading the SAICA Council to appoint Sehole as the first black chief executive officer. He had to use his professional skills and persuasive powers to ensure that Sehole moved into a welcoming environment. Similarly, Wiseman had to ensure that Sehole was at ease in taking up the position, and in particular, that he came to it with an open and proactive mindset to make a difference. The opportunity to appoint a black chief executive for SAICA arose when the highly respected Ken Mockler, who who had served in the position for nearly 2 decades, indicated his intention to retire in 1998. Mohlahlana was highly respected, and therefore Wiseman had to move with care and not antagonize him. Fortunately, Mohlahlana did not interfere with the selection process. In the year 2000, in what was a watershed moment for SAICA, the Institute finally appointed Sihole its first black CEO. Wiseman was not surprised that Sihole was instantly a great success. Besides his efficiency, he had good human management skills. He was comfortable and not overwhelmed at being the first black CEO of SAICA, and so he was able to deal with sensitive issues of racism without being angry or alienating those he had to unite and lead.
That was another episode of A Life of Purpose, second edition, written by Luvuyo Wochela and Lumkile Wiseman Kuhlu. The book is available online on www.kmmr.co.za, KMMR Publishers, and in all leading bookstores countrywide. It is broadcast on SAFM at 11:45 Monday to Thursday on The Talking Point. It is produced for the station by Vovi Patala, read by Lerato Mvelase, technical production Wiseman Manqele and Nanda Khoza.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's 12 o'clock on Monday, the 14th of October, 2024. Very warm welcome to Update at Noon here on SAFM. Leading the conversation, I'm Sakina Kamwendo. Coming up on today's show,
it's been laced together with thanking the people who voted for the African National Congress, for which we're in the campaign. It feels sad, but we will not be going as a Communist Party.
the South African Communist Party is snubbing an invitation from its alliance partner, the ANC, to celebrate 100 days in the Government of National Unity.
Will be remembered not only for his immense contribution to the economy, but also for his unwavering connection to the people he served.
And tributes continue to pour in for former Finance Minister and former Reserve Bank Governor Tito Mboweni. Coming up in sport,
Hugo Bruce blames SAFA and the venue for the disgusting display by fans at the weekend. And we look ahead to all the other AFCON qualifiers coming up.
Can't wait to hear that. John Kirk with those details in the second half of the show. Please share your views with us. 41391 is the SMS line number, and you can get in touch with us there. It will cost you R1.50 per SMS. You can also write to us via X or Facebook, our handle at SABC News_radio, or you can send us a voice note on 08269239909. Well, these and more stories coming up on this Monday edition of Updated Noon. First, though, let's bring you up to speed with the latest news with Mudupi Makhalimele.
Thank you very much, SK. The top stories this hour: the JSC interviews for the Western Cape Judge President, and Ramaphosa reflects on the GNU. A very good afternoon to you. The acting Western Cape High Court Judge President, Patricia Goliath, has sought to explain her leadership style before the JSC. A range of questions were put to her on the relationship between judges and her management of the division. She's one of 7 judges vying for the position of Judge President of the Bench. There have been various complaints laid against her by other judges in the division, such as the lack of prompt communication, in which the judges would also need to have a say. However, Goliath has disputed the allegations profusely.
Chief Justice, I'm the one who introduced judges' meetings. Judges are free to place any items on the agenda, and that is how we've been running. I have an open door policy. I'm most certainly not a dictator. I can reassure this commission any judge can come and raise any issue with me. I did not actually get the impression that she was saying that judges don't have a voice in her comments. The fact of the matter is, I re-established regular judges' meetings. I re-established the tea room to promote collegiality, and any allegation that judges don't have a voice, I must refute those allegations. It is most certainly not true.
More South Africans as well as business are confident in the direction that the country is taking, which is good news for job creation and economic growth. This is according to President Cyril Ramaphosa in his letter to the nation today. The president says that the improved sentiment is informed by the effective transition to the GNU, which enjoys wide support from across society, and progress in addressing challenges such as those in the energy and the transport sectors. Busichi Mombe reports.
Improved citizen and business confidence in the country's growth prospects must be harnessed to make a real difference in the lives of South Africans, according to President Cyril Ramaphosa. He says improved investment sentiment will improve the country's fiscus, allow for increased expenditure on infrastructure and social services, and create more jobs and opportunities. The President says that a firm foundation for growth has been laid by the GNU, and the country is headed in the right direction. Busichi Mombe, SABC News.
The CEO of Business Unity SA, Cas Kuvadia, has paid tribute to his friend and former Finance Minister Tito Mboweni. He says Mboweni will be remembered for his forward thinking in developing economies, but also for his genuine heart for the people. Mboweni, who was notably a former Reserve Bank governor, passed away on Saturday after a short illness. Kuvadia says the news came as a shock to him as he met with a healthy-looking Mboweni just 2 months ago.
Last time I saw Tito, which was probably about 2 months ago or so, he was what Tito always is, gregarious, normal, friendly, and no sign of any illness. So it's a shock that it's very sudden, certainly from what I know. And, I knew Tito from the days he came back from exile, and he was a very, very important part of the ANC. He made a significant impact there, and as First Minister of Labour at a time when the country had to ensure that we have labour laws that are fair and we treat workers well. He excelled as Minister of Finance and Governor of the Reserve Bank.
The community of Dali Bunga Informal Settlement in Orange Farm is calling for strict regulations on taverns in the area. This after 7 people were shot dead in the early hours of yesterday morning. The incident is alleged to have been sparked by a fight that ensued between a tavern owner and a male patron. The tavern owner allegedly followed the male patron, who was a visitor at a nearby house, and on arrival, he fired shots randomly, killing 7 people, including a 3-year-old child. And Taiwan has condemned large-scale military drills by China surrounding the island, calling them irrational and provocative. Beijing, which considers Taiwan part of its own territory, says the exercises were a warning against separatist acts. The BBC's Rupert Wingfield-Hayes.
Taiwan has been expecting China to launch fresh drills and even predicted they would do so following Taiwan's National Day last week. Off the record, officials here say China appears to be practicing for a sea and air blockade of the island. They say Taiwan has little choice but to remain calm and continue reforming its own military and building its weapons strength to make any future attack on the island by China far more costly.
The top story this hour, the acting Western Cape High Court Judge President Patricia Goliath has sought to explain her leadership style before the JSC. Back to you, SK, for SAFM News. Kimudupi Makhalemel.
Update at noon with Sakina Kamwendo, midday to 1 p.m. Update at noon with Sakina Kamwendo.
Well, thanks, Madupi. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much for tuning in to Update at Noon. And just taking a quick look at some of the stories that we are tracking this afternoon. Madupi speaking there of the JSC interviews, among others, and the Judicial Service Commission interviewing today to fill the position of Judge President of the Western Cape Division of the High Court. And that was the division, of course, that Dr. John Hlophe was removed from. So a total of 7 candidates will be interviewed, including the acting Judge Patricia Goliath, who is currently acting Judge President in that court. And you heard a snippet in the news from what she had to say and how her interview went. I must say, I was listening to that